Modern physics has a strange problem. According to the most successful theory ever developed to describe nature, reality may not be fully defined until it is observed. At first glance, this sounds almost philosophical, but it isn't speculation. It comes directly from the mathematics of quantum mechanics, the same theory responsible for the technologies that quietly run our modern world. Transistors, lasers, MRI machines, even the GPS signals guiding your phone. All of them rely on quantum principles with extraordinary precision. In fact, quantum mechanics is one of the most accurate scientific theories ever created. Its predictions have been confirmed to an astonishing degree of accuracy across thousands of experiments. And yet, at the center of this incredibly successful theory lies a quiet but profound puzzle. Quantum mechanics does not describe objects the way classical physics once did. In classical physics, a particle has a definite position and a definite state, whether you are looking at it or not. Measurement simply reveals what was already there. But in the quantum world, things behave very differently. Instead of existing in a single definite state, a particle is described by something called a wave function. This wave function does not tell us where the particle actually is. Instead, it describes a range of possible states the particle could occupy. Multiple positions, multiple energies, multiple potential outcomes, all of them existing simultaneously in a condition known as superposition. Mathematically, this works beautifully. As long as a quantum system remains unobserved, its wave function evolves smoothly according to a precise equation discovered by Erwin Schrödinger. Nothing dramatic happens. All possibilities continue to coexist. But something strange occurs the moment a measurement takes place. The wave function suddenly collapses. Out of all the possible states, only one becomes real. Every other possibility disappears. This transition from many possibilities to one definite outcome is one of the most mysterious features of quantum theory. And the unsettling part is this. Quantum mechanics predicts that the collapse happens, but it never actually explains why it happens. This puzzle is known as the measurement problem. And once you start looking closely at it, the implications become difficult to ignore. Because if reality only becomes definite when something observes it, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly counts as an observer? At first, the idea of observation in physics seems simple. In classical science, measurement is passive. A thermometer does not create temperature. A ruler does not create length. A camera does not create the object it photographs. These tools simply reveal properties that were already there. But quantum mechanics breaks this assumption in a very unsettling way. Before a measurement occurs, the properties of a quantum system are not merely unknown, they are undefined. The act of measurement does not simply reveal reality. It appears to create a definite outcome out of many possibilities. For a long time, physicists tried to avoid confronting this implication directly. The most widely accepted explanation became known as the Copenhagen interpretation. According to this view, quantum mechanics does not describe reality itself. It only describes our knowledge of reality. Asking what a particle truly is before measurement is considered meaningless. In this framework, reality and observation become inseparable. For decades, this philosophical retreat was tolerated because the mathematics worked perfectly. But one question refused to disappear. If observation causes the wave function to collapse, what exactly qualifies as an observation? To understand why this question becomes unavoidable, we need to follow the measurement process step by step. Imagine a particle interacting with a measuring device. The device registers a signal. That signal is detected by electronic equipment. The electronics convert the signal into data. The data appears on a screen. Light from that screen enters your eyes. Your brain processes the information. And somewhere along this entire chain of physical events, the wave function must stop evolving as probabilities and collapse into a single outcome. But where exactly does that transition occur? At the detector? At the electronics? At the screen? At the brain? Or at the moment you become consciously aware of the result? This question led mathematician and physicist John von Neumann to formalize what is now known as the von Neumann chain. His analysis revealed something surprising. Every component in the measurement process, the particle, the detector, the electronics, even the brain, can be treated as a quantum system. And if each part follows the same quantum rules, then each part should also be capable of existing in superposition. In other words, the measuring device does not escape quantum behavior. Neither does the detector, neither does the brain. If we apply quantum mechanics consistently to all physical systems, the chain never naturally breaks. The equations simply continue, which leads to a deeply uncomfortable possibility. The collapse may not occur at any physical device at all. Von Neumann suggested that the only place where the chain could logically terminate without contradiction was at the level of conscious awareness itself. Not at the instrument, not at the brain as a physical object, but at the moment, an observation becomes part of experience. Needless to say, this idea was not enthusiastically embraced. Most physicists preferred to treat the measurement problem as a practical issue rather than a philosophical one. But the logic behind the question remained difficult to ignore. And soon, another thought experiment would make the paradox even more difficult to escape. The measurement problem becomes even stranger when we introduce more than one observer. In the early 1960s, physicist Eugene Wigner proposed a thought experiment that would push this paradox to its limits. Imagine a sealed laboratory. Inside the room, a scientist is performing a quantum measurement on a particle. The experiment is simple. The particle can produce one of two possible outcomes: result A or result B. Inside the laboratory, the scientist observes the measurement and records the result. From their perspective, the wave function has already collapsed. They see a definite outcome. Reality for them has become specific. But now imagine that you are standing outside the laboratory. The door is closed. You have no access to what happened inside. From your perspective, you must treat everything inside the lab as a quantum system: the particle, the measuring device, the laboratory itself, and even your friend inside the room. According to the equations of quantum mechanics, the entire laboratory should now exist in superposition. One version of the system contains your friend observing result A. Another version contains your friend observing result B. From your point of view, both possibilities coexist simultaneously. Now the question becomes unavoidable. When did the wave function actually collapse? Did it collapse when your friend first looked at the measurement? Or does it collapse only when you open the door and learn what your friend observed? If your friend's observation already collapsed the wave function, then from your perspective, something in the universe became definite without your awareness. But if the collapse requires your observation, then your friend must have existed in a strange superposition state until you opened the door. In that scenario, there were two versions of your friend, one seeing result A, one seeing result B, and both existing simultaneously until you became aware of the outcome. Both possibilities lead to deeply unsettling implications. One suggests that reality may depend on the observer who experiences it. The other suggests that even conscious observers can exist in superposition. Wigner himself took the problem seriously. For a period of time, he openly argued that consciousness might play a fundamental role in the laws of physics. Later in his career, he softened that claim. But the paradox he introduced never truly disappeared. Because once we ask whether consciousness plays a role in defining reality, we are immediately forced into a second mystery. A mystery that physics alone has never been able to resolve. The mystery of what consciousness actually is. At this point, physics runs directly into a second mystery. Even if we set quantum mechanics aside for a moment, consciousness itself remains one of the most unresolved questions in science. Modern neuroscience has made extraordinary progress in understanding the brain. We know that neurons communicate through electrical and chemical signals. We can observe large networks of brain regions coordinating complex tasks. Damage a specific area of the brain and certain abilities disappear. Vision can be lost, memory can fail, language can break down. These correlations are clear and well documented. But beneath all of these mechanisms lies a deeper question that neuroscience still struggles to answer. Why does neural activity produce subjective experience at all? Why does information processing feel like something from the inside? This question is known as the hard problem of consciousness, a term popularized by philosopher David Chalmers. The problem is not simply how the brain processes information. Machines can process information too. Modern computers can recognize faces, translate languages, play complex games, and solve problems that once required human intelligence. But none of these systems appear to have an inner world. A computer can analyze the wavelength of light that we call red. It can categorize it, label it, and even reproduce it on a screen. But nothing in that process explains why redness feels red. Nothing explains why pain hurts, or why awareness exists as a first-person experience rather than a purely external process. Physics, by its nature, describes the world from the outside. It tells us how particles move, how energy flows, and how systems interact. But consciousness is known only from the inside. It is the one phenomenon in the universe that cannot be directly observed from the outside at all. And this creates a deep conceptual gap. Neuroscience can map brain activity with incredible precision. But mapping activity is not the same as explaining experience, which leads to a difficult possibility. What if consciousness cannot be fully explained using the same classical framework that explains machines and computers? And if quantum mechanics already forces us to confront the role of observation in defining reality, then perhaps these two mysteries are not separate problems at all. Perhaps the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality are connected in ways that modern science is only beginning to explore. This idea does not imply that consciousness is mystical or supernatural. It suggests something more subtle, that our current description of the universe may be incomplete in a very specific way. Because it describes the world as if observation were irrelevant, while ignoring the one phenomenon that makes observation possible in the first place. And if consciousness truly plays a role in how reality becomes definite, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If the mind is not simply a classical machine, what kind of physical process could give rise to awareness at all? One of the most unusual attempts to answer this question came from an unexpected place. Not neuroscience, not philosophy, but mathematics. The physicist and mathematician Roger Penrose began examining consciousness from a direction most people would never think to look: the limits of computation itself. Much of modern neuroscience is built on an assumption inherited from computer science. The brain, in this view, is essentially an information processing machine. Neurons fire, signals propagate, networks compute. Consciousness is then interpreted as what it feels like when a sufficiently complex biological algorithm runs inside the brain. In other words, the mind is treated as a kind of biological computer. Penrose was deeply skeptical of this assumption, and his skepticism came from a surprising source: mathematical logic. In the 1930s, mathematician Kurt Gödel proved something remarkable about formal systems. Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that any sufficiently powerful logical system will always contain true statements that cannot be proven using the rules of that system. No matter how complete the system appears, there will always be truths that lie beyond its formal structure. Penrose noticed something deeply unsettling about this. Human mathematicians are often able to recognize the truth of certain statements that cannot be formally derived from a given system. Not through brute force calculation, but through insight, through understanding. If the human mind were nothing more than an algorithm running on biological hardware, then human reasoning should be limited by the same constraints as any formal computational system. But human reasoning often appears to step outside the system, to see its structure, and to recognize truths that cannot be generated purely through algorithmic rules. Penrose's conclusion was controversial. He argued that human understanding may not be fully computable. In other words, the mind might not be reducible to a classical algorithm at all. If that is true, then the brain cannot simply be functioning like a digital computer. And if the brain is not operating purely within classical computation, then it must be doing something else. Penrose suspected that the answer might lie in quantum physics. But not in the vague sense that people sometimes imagine when they casually mention quantum effects. He proposed something far more specific, a physical process built directly into the structure of space-time itself. In standard quantum theory, the collapse of the wave function is treated almost like a rule. A measurement happens. Probabilities become facts. But Penrose found this explanation incomplete. It relies on measurement without explaining what measurement fundamentally is. So he proposed an alternative idea known as objective reduction. According to Penrose, wave function collapse is not merely a mathematical rule triggered by observation. It is a real physical process built into the fabric of the universe. To understand why, we need to consider two of the most successful theories in physics: quantum mechanics and general relativity. Quantum mechanics allows particles to exist in superposition, but general relativity tells us that mass and energy curve spacetime. Now imagine an object existing in two positions at once. If the object has mass, then each position would produce a slightly different curvature of spacetime. In other words, spacetime itself would be forced into two different geometries simultaneously. Penrose argued that this situation cannot remain stable forever. Beyond a certain threshold, the superposition becomes unstable, and spacetime resolves the conflict by collapsing into one configuration. No observer required. No measurement device, just gravity enforcing consistency. Penrose called this process objective reduction, a physical collapse of quantum states caused by the structure of spacetime itself. And here is where his theory takes a dramatic turn. Penrose suggested that each such collapse might correspond to a moment of conscious experience. In this view, consciousness would not be a continuous stream. It would be a sequence of discrete physical events occurring as quantum states collapse. But for this idea to work, the brain would need a place where such quantum processes could occur. And that raised a new question. If consciousness depends on quantum events, where in the brain could such processes actually take place? If Penrose was correct, the brain would need a physical structure capable of supporting quantum processes. But Penrose himself was not a neuroscientist. He understood the mathematics and the physics, but he did not know where in the brain such processes might occur. That is where Stuart Hameroff enters the story. Hameroff is an anesthesiologist who became interested in consciousness through a very unusual observation. General anesthesia reliably removes conscious experience. Patients under anesthesia lose awareness completely, and yet many basic neural processes continue to function. The brain still shows electrical activity. Reflexes can remain intact. In some cases, memory formation can still occur. What disappears is not neural activity itself. What disappears is subjective experience. Hameroff noticed something curious about how anesthetic molecules work. They do not primarily shut down large-scale neural firing. Instead, they bind strongly to tiny structures inside neurons called microtubules. Microtubules are part of the cell's internal skeleton. They help maintain the shape of neurons. They transport molecules within the cell. For decades, they were considered mostly structural components, important for cell stability, but not for information processing. But Hameroff suspected they might be doing something more. Microtubules are built from repeating protein units arranged in highly ordered patterns. At very small scales, this arrangement resembles a kind of biological lattice. And in physics, certain lattices can support coherent quantum states. Together, Penrose and Hameroff proposed a theory known as orchestrated objective reduction, often abbreviated as OR. According to this model, Microtubules inside neurons may act as quantum information processors. Within their lattice structures, molecular components could exist in quantum superposition, functioning somewhat like quantum bits rather than classical ones. These superpositions would evolve coherently for a brief period, influenced by the surrounding neural activity. Eventually, when the system reaches the threshold described by Penrose's gravitational collapse model, the quantum state undergoes objective reduction. The wave function collapses, and according to the theory, each such collapse corresponds to a moment of conscious experience. In this framework, consciousness is not continuous. It is a rapid sequence of discrete events, a cascade of quantum collapses occurring many times per second. Some proponents of the theory estimate roughly 40 such events per second, which intriguingly aligns with certain brain rhythms associated with conscious awareness. This idea offers potential explanations for several puzzling features of experience. Why consciousness feels unified even though the brain processes information in many separate regions. Why insights sometimes appear suddenly rather than gradually. And how sensory inputs arriving at different times are perceived as part of a single moment of awareness. But for many years, most scientists dismissed this theory almost immediately, because the brain, at least on the surface, seems like one of the worst environments imaginable for delicate quantum effects. It is warm, it is wet, and it is extremely noisy. Quantum coherence is usually fragile. In laboratory experiments, maintaining quantum states often requires extreme isolation and temperatures near absolute zero. Inside the brain, molecules are constantly vibrating, ions are flowing, thermal noise is everywhere. Under these conditions, any quantum state should decohere almost instantly. For a long time, this criticism seemed fatal to the idea of quantum consciousness. But biology has a habit of exploiting physical phenomena in ways physicists did not initially expect. And over the past 2 decades, a new field has begun to explore exactly that possibility. The field now known as quantum biology. For many scientists, the OR theory appeared to fail for a very simple reason. The brain seemed far too chaotic for quantum mechanics to survive inside it. Quantum coherence is fragile. In laboratory experiments, maintaining delicate quantum states usually requires extremely controlled environments, often near absolute zero, often shielded from noise, vibration, and thermal disturbances. The brain is the exact opposite of that environment. It operates at body temperature. Its cells are filled with constantly moving molecules. Electrical signals propagate through networks of neurons. Ions are flowing through membranes every millisecond. From the perspective of traditional physics, this environment should destroy quantum coherence almost instantly. This destruction of quantum states is known as decoherence. And decoherence happens extremely fast. In systems exposed to thermal noise, quantum superpositions can collapse in fractions of a nanosecond. Because of this, many physicists concluded that large-scale quantum effects inside the brain were essentially impossible. To them, the OR theory sounded interesting but unrealistic. A speculative idea that could not survive real biological conditions. For years, this criticism was considered decisive. The brain was simply too warm and too noisy. Quantum coherence, it seemed, had no place in biology, and for a long time, the debate appeared settled. Consciousness would remain a classical phenomenon. The brain would remain a biological computer, and quantum mechanics would stay confined to the microscopic world of particles and atoms. But then, something unexpected began to appear in experimental biology. Researchers studying one of the most ordinary processes in nature made a discovery that forced scientists to reconsider their assumptions. The process was photosynthesis, and what they found suggested that living systems might be capable of sustaining quantum effects in ways that physics had not anticipated. If that were true, then the boundary between classical biology and quantum physics might not be as clear as we once believed. And if biological systems can exploit quantum phenomena, then the possibility of quantum processes in the brain may not be as impossible as it once seemed. For a long time, physicists assumed that quantum effects belonged only to the microscopic world. Atoms, electrons, subatomic particles. Living organisms, on the other hand, were thought to operate entirely within classical physics. Biology was expected to be too warm, too complex, and too noisy for delicate quantum phenomena to survive. But in the early 2000s, an unexpected discovery challenged this assumption. Researchers studying photosynthesis began to notice something strange in how plants transfer energy inside their cells. When a photon of light is absorbed by a plant, the energy must travel through a network of molecules to reach a reaction center where it can be converted into chemical energy. For years, scientists assumed this energy simply hopped randomly from one molecule to another until it eventually reached its destination. But detailed experiments revealed something far more surprising. The energy appeared to explore multiple pathways simultaneously. Instead of moving step by step through the molecular network, it behaved as if it were testing many possible routes at once and selecting the most efficient path. This behavior strongly resembled quantum superposition. Even more surprising, these effects appeared to persist at room temperature. In other words, quantum coherence was occurring inside living biological systems without the extreme conditions normally required in physics laboratories. This discovery gave rise to a new interdisciplinary field, now known as quantum biology. Since then, researchers have begun investigating whether quantum effects might play roles in several biological processes. Photosynthesis was the first major example. But studies have also explored possible quantum mechanisms in bird navigation, enzyme reactions, and even olfaction. These discoveries do not prove that the brain uses quantum computation, but they change the landscape of the discussion. The idea that biological systems could maintain coherent quantum states was once considered impossible. Now it is simply considered unusual. Which brings us back to the brain. If biological systems can exploit quantum phenomena under the right conditions, then the question becomes more interesting. Could the brain have evolved structures that sit precisely at the boundary between classical and quantum physics? Some recent research suggests that microtubules, the structures central to the OR theory, may exhibit unusual electromagnetic properties. In particular, certain experiments have suggested the possibility of superradiance. In simple terms, superradiance occurs when many microscopic components behave collectively as a single coherent system. Instead of acting independently, they synchronize in a way that amplifies quantum effects rather than allowing them to decay. If microtubules can support such collective behavior, then they might be able to sustain coherent quantum states far longer than previously expected. And if that is the case, then the brain may not simply be a classical machine occasionally disturbed by quantum noise. It may be a biological system that evolved to operate right at the boundary where the quantum and classical worlds meet. And that possibility leads to an even more unsettling question. Because if consciousness depends on quantum processes, then it may not be confined to purely local interactions inside the brain. It may be connected to something much larger. To understand why, we have to look at one of the strangest features of quantum physics itself, a phenomenon known as entanglement. Up to this point, the discussion has remained unusual, but still somewhat contained. We have considered the possibility that the brain might rely on quantum processes. We have explored the idea that biological systems could sustain quantum coherence under certain conditions. But quantum mechanics contains another feature that pushes this discussion far beyond the boundaries of neuroscience, a phenomenon known as entanglement. Entanglement occurs when two quantum systems interact in such a way that their properties become deeply connected. After that interaction, the systems can no longer be described independently. They must be described as a single shared state. What makes entanglement extraordinary is what happens next. If you measure one of the entangled particles, the state of the other becomes immediately constrained. Even if the particles are separated by enormous distances, the correlation appears instantly, not through a signal traveling through space, not through a hidden exchange of information, but because the two systems remain part of a single quantum structure. When Albert Einstein first encountered this implication, he found it deeply troubling. He famously referred to it as spooky action at a distance. To Einstein, this behavior seemed to violate one of the most basic assumptions in physics, that objects exist independently and influence each other only through local interactions. But decades of experiments have repeatedly confirmed entanglement, from laboratory tests with photons to satellite experiments spanning thousands of kilometers. The results have been consistent. Entanglement is not a mathematical trick. It appears to be a genuine feature of the universe, and its implications are difficult to ignore. At the deepest level, reality may not be composed of separate objects interacting across space. Instead, it may be better understood as a network of relationships that cannot be fully separated. If consciousness depends on quantum processes, then this raises an intriguing possibility. Consciousness may not be entirely local either. In classical neuroscience, the brain is treated as a modular machine. Different regions process different kinds of information. Visual input is handled in one area, auditory signals in another. Memory, emotion, and bodily sensations in still other regions. Yet despite this fragmentation, our experience feels unified. We do not perceive separate streams of information. We experience a single coherent moment. This puzzle is known as the binding problem. How does the brain integrate many distributed processes into one unified experience? Classical explanations often point to neural synchronization. Different regions of the brain may coordinate their activity through rhythmic patterns of electrical signaling. But synchronization alone explains coordination. It does not fully explain unity of experience. Quantum coherence offers a different possibility. In a coherent quantum system, spatially separated components can behave as a single unified system, not through signals traveling back and forth, but through shared quantum states. Some experimental studies using advanced brain imaging techniques have observed correlations between distant brain regions that are difficult to explain using purely classical models. These findings do not prove that entanglement exists inside the brain. But they hint that the brain may be more deeply integrated than traditional neuroscience once assumed. If microtubules or other biological structures can support coherent quantum states across neural networks, then consciousness might not simply be an emergent property of classical computation, it might be a genuinely unified physical process. And if that process depends on the same quantum principles that allow entanglement, then consciousness may not be confined to a strictly local region inside the skull. The brain may anchor awareness, but the underlying processes could be participating in a much broader structure, one that extends beyond the boundaries we normally assume. And this leads to a remarkable idea that some physicists have proposed: the idea of a participatory universe. A universe in which observers are not external to reality, but part of the process that brings reality into its definite form. If the observer plays a role in how quantum events become definite, then the relationship between consciousness and the universe may be more intimate than classical physics ever imagined. This idea was explored by physicist John Archibald Wheeler, who proposed what he called the participatory universe. Wheeler suggested that observers are not merely passive witnesses of a pre-existing reality. Instead, observation may be part of the mechanism through which the universe becomes specific rather than indefinite. In classical physics, the universe exists independently of observation. Stars form, planets orbit, galaxies collide. All of it unfolds whether anyone is watching or not. Observation simply records what has already happened. Quantum mechanics complicates this picture. In the quantum framework, physical systems evolve as a range of possibilities. Only when a measurement occurs does one outcome become real. This does not necessarily mean that human consciousness literally creates reality, but it suggests something more subtle. The act of interaction, of information becoming definite, plays a fundamental role in how the universe unfolds. In Wheeler's view, observers are not external to the universe. They are part of the system itself. Every observation participates in selecting one outcome from many possible states. The universe, in this sense, may not be a finished structure. It may be an ongoing process of becoming, a process in which reality gradually crystallizes through interactions occurring throughout the cosmos. This idea may sound philosophical, but it emerges directly from attempts to interpret the mathematical structure of quantum theory, and it carries an intriguing implication. If conscious systems are themselves quantum systems, and if their observations correspond to physical events that reduce quantum possibilities into definite outcomes, then consciousness may not simply observe reality. It may participate in how reality becomes definite. Of course, this does not mean the human mind can arbitrarily control the universe. Quantum processes are probabilistic and constrained by physical laws. But it does suggest that awareness may not be an accidental byproduct of the universe. Instead, it may be woven into the same processes that allow the universe to become specific rather than indefinite. At this point, however, the discussion begins to move even further away from conventional physics, because once we begin questioning the role of the observer, we are eventually forced to confront an even deeper possibility. What if the world we perceive is not reality as it truly is? What if space, time, and objects are not the fundamental structure of the universe, but something more like an interface through which we interact with a deeper level of reality? This possibility has been explored by a cognitive scientist whose work challenges one of our most basic assumptions about perception, Hoffman. At a certain depth, attempts to explain consciousness stop looking like extensions of neuroscience. They begin to look more like reconstructions of reality itself. Because once we ask how consciousness fits into the universe, we are forced to reconsider the assumptions we make about the universe in the first place. One of the most direct challenges to those assumptions comes from cognitive scientist Hoffman. Hoffman approaches the problem of perception from an evolutionary perspective, and his starting point is simple. Natural selection does not reward organisms for seeing reality as it truly is. It rewards organisms for surviving long enough to reproduce. Accuracy is not the primary goal. Utility is. If a perception is useful for survival, it will be favored by evolution, even if it is not an accurate representation of the underlying world. Hoffman and his colleagues explored this idea through computational simulations. In these models, different types of virtual organisms competed for survival. Some agents perceived reality accurately. Others perceived simplified representations that were useful for survival, but not necessarily true. The results were surprising. Organisms that saw reality accurately were consistently outcompeted by organisms that perceived simplified, survival-optimized interfaces. In other words, evolution favored efficient illusions over accurate representations. From this perspective, our perceptions may not be windows into reality. They may function more like a user interface. To understand this idea, consider the desktop of a computer. When you see a blue folder icon on your screen, you do not assume there is a tiny blue folder inside the machine. The icon is simply a convenient symbol. It hides the underlying complexity of voltages, transistors, and machine code. It provides an interface that allows you to interact with a deeper system without needing to understand its full structure. Hoffman suggests that perception may work in a similar way. The objects we see, chairs, trees, bodies, planets, may function like icons on the desktop of reality. They are useful for navigation, but they may not represent the fundamental structure of the universe. In this view, space and time themselves could be part of the interface, the stage on which our experiences appear, but not the ultimate foundation of reality. If that is the case, then the deeper layer beneath the interface might look very different from the world we perceive. In Hoffman's model, the fundamental elements of reality are not particles or fields. They are conscious agents, not human minds, but minimal units of experience and decision. These agents interact with one another. Their interactions generate networks of relationships, and the structures that emerge from those interactions appear to us as the physical world. Matter, in this framework, does not give rise to consciousness. Instead, consciousness gives rise to the appearance of matter. The brain, then, would not be the generator of experience. It would be part of the interface, a structure that allows a conscious system to interact with a particular slice of reality. Much like a virtual reality headset allows a user to interact with a simulated environment. This idea is controversial. Many scientists remain skeptical, but it aligns in surprising ways with certain features of quantum mechanics. The observer-dependent nature of measurement. The relational structure of entanglement. The difficulty of defining physical properties independent of interaction. All of these hints suggest that reality may not be composed of independent objects after all. Instead, it may emerge from relationships between systems that interact and exchange information. But even this perspective assumes something important. It assumes that there is still one universe, one reality underlying the interface. Quantum mechanics offers another interpretation that takes a more radical step, one that removes the idea of collapse entirely, an interpretation known as many worlds. One of the most radical interpretations of quantum mechanics begins with a simple refusal. It refuses to accept that the wave function ever collapses. In the traditional view, a quantum system evolves as a set of possibilities until a measurement occurs. At that moment, the wave function collapses and one outcome becomes real. But the many worlds interpretation, first proposed by physicist Hugh Everett, rejects this collapse entirely. According to this view, the mathematics of quantum mechanics should be taken literally. The wave function never collapses. Instead, every possible outcome of a quantum event actually occurs. When a measurement happens, reality does not select a single result. It branches. One branch of the universe contains outcome A. Another branch contains outcome B. Both outcomes exist. They simply continue evolving separately. From the inside of any given branch, it appears as if one outcome occurred and the others disappeared. But from the perspective of the full quantum state, all possibilities remain part of the unfolding universe. This interpretation has a certain elegance. It removes the measurement problem entirely. There is no mysterious collapse to explain. The universe simply evolves according to the Schrödinger equation at all times. But this solution introduces a very different kind of discomfort, because if every quantum event generates branching realities, then the universe is constantly splitting into an unimaginable number of parallel histories. At every moment, countless variations of events unfold across different branches. Most of these branches remain forever inaccessible to us, but their existence follows naturally from the equations themselves. This idea leads to a disturbing philosophical implication sometimes referred to as quantum immortality. Imagine a thought experiment involving a device connected to a quantum event. Each time the device activates, a quantum process determines whether it triggers a fatal outcome or not. In many branches of reality, the outcome is fatal. In some branches, it is not. From the perspective of an outside observer, survival becomes extremely unlikely after repeated trials. But from the inside, something strange happens. Consciousness cannot experience its own absence. There is no subjective moment in which awareness observes itself as gone. From the perspective of experience, you only ever find yourself in the branches where awareness continues. This does not mean a person becomes physically invincible. It means that from the inside, consciousness only ever experiences the timelines in which it persists. Across the broader multiverse, there are branches in which survival fails. But those branches contain no continuing observer. Over time, the number of branches where awareness continues becomes extremely small, but subjectively, they are the only branches that can ever be experienced. This idea pushes our understanding of identity to its limits. If reality constantly branches into countless possibilities, then there are versions of you who made different decisions. Versions of you who experience different lives. Versions of you who exist in timelines you will never encounter. In this framework, identity becomes less like a fixed entity and more like a path through an enormous landscape of possible histories. And this raises a profound question. If consciousness persists only along certain paths through this branching structure, then what exactly is consciousness navigating? Is it a product of physical processes unfolding in space-time? Or could it be something deeper? Something that uses space-time as a framework for experience rather than being confined by it? At this point, it becomes tempting to look for a final answer, to decide which theory is correct, which interpretation of quantum mechanics will ultimately survive, which model of consciousness will finally explain the relationship between mind and reality. But that impulse itself reflects an assumption inherited from classical thinking. The belief that reality must eventually collapse into a single, clear explanation. Quantum mechanics has repeatedly challenged that expectation. And when it comes to consciousness, the situation remains deeply unresolved. The OR theory remains controversial. Many neuroscientists consider it unnecessary. Many physicists remain skeptical that gravity-induced collapse has anything to do with awareness. Donald Hoffman's theory of conscious agents offers an intriguing mathematical framework, but it remains far from experimental confirmation. The many worlds interpretation eliminates collapse entirely, but introduces a universe branching endlessly into parallel histories. None of these ideas has achieved consensus, and yet something important has already changed. The problem is no longer simply how consciousness fits into the existing scientific picture. The deeper question is whether the existing picture was ever complete without it. Classical physics described a universe made of objects moving through space and evolving through time. A universe that existed independently of observation. In that framework, consciousness appeared as an anomaly, a late arrival, a byproduct of sufficiently complex biological machinery. Quantum mechanics undermined that narrative at its foundation. At the deepest level we can currently describe, the universe is not a collection of solid objects with fixed properties. It is a structure of probabilities, relationships, and potentialities. Properties do not become definite until interactions occur. Information does not exist independently of the processes that reveal it. Reality, in this sense, is not simply a static structure. It is something that unfolds through interaction. Neuroscience has undergone a similar shift. The brain is no longer viewed as a passive receiver of sensory information. It is predictive. It is integrative. It actively constructs the experience we call reality. Perception is not a direct recording of the external world. It is an ongoing process of interpretation. If quantum processes contribute even partially to that process, then consciousness may not merely run on top of physics. It may be entangled with it. This possibility carries an important implication. The boundary between mind and world may not be as rigid as it feels. The sense of being an isolated observer located behind the eyes, looking out at an external universe, may be a useful interface rather than a literal description of reality. The brain may function less like a self-contained machine and more like a portal of interaction, a system through which the universe becomes aware of particular experiences. From this perspective, many long-standing debates begin to look different. The question of whether consciousness exists only in the brain or extends beyond it may rely on assumptions about locality that quantum mechanics no longer fully supports. The debate about free will may depend on classical ideas of deterministic causality that quantum physics has already complicated. Even our concept of personal identity may be less stable than it appears. What remains consistent across all these frameworks is not certainty, but displacement. The universe stops looking like a finished object and begins to look like an ongoing process. A process in which matter, information, observation, and experience may be far more deeply connected than classical science once imagined. And this leads us to a final thought, not a conclusion. but an open question. At this point, it may be tempting to search for certainty, to hope that one day, science will produce a clean explanation that finally settles the relationship between mind and matter. But the deeper we explore the foundations of reality, the more that expectation begins to dissolve. Quantum mechanics did not introduce consciousness into science. What it did was reveal that consciousness had quietly been left out of the picture all along. For centuries, scientific models were built to describe the universe from the outside. Particles, forces, fields, objects moving through space and evolving through time. But none of those equations ever included the one phenomenon that makes observation possible in the first place: experience. The fact that the universe is not only happening, but is also being experienced. When quantum mechanics exposed the strange role of observation in physical processes, it did not prove that consciousness creates reality, but it forced scientists to confront a possibility that had long been ignored. That reality may not be fully defined without the role of observers within it. This does not guarantee meaning. It does not imply cosmic purpose or destiny. Those interpretations belong to philosophy and culture, not to physics. What science suggests is something quieter, but perhaps more profound. The universe may not be a finished structure waiting to be discovered. It may be an unfolding process. A process in which matter, information, interaction, and experience are inseparable parts of the same phenomenon. In that picture, consciousness is not a ghost haunting the machinery of the brain, and it is not merely an accidental side effect of complex neurons. It may be one of the ways the universe differentiates itself, not a ruler standing outside reality measuring it, but a process through which potential becomes experience, a way in which the universe encounters itself. Whether that idea ultimately proves correct remains uncertain. New experiments may challenge these theories. New discoveries may reshape our understanding once again. But the direction of the inquiry is already clear. Science is slowly moving away from a universe in which the mind is an afterthought, and toward a universe in which observation, information, and experience are woven into the fabric of reality itself, not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as a reminder of something physics has been teaching us for over a century. The deeper we look into the nature of reality, the stranger it becomes. And the act of trying to understand it may itself be part of the mystery we are exploring.